It's one pass.
There we go. Let's save the space this morning.
Yeah.
Awesome.
With the statuses, they have a land disturbance plan that is, so they're moving, it's a tough market, but their requirements are to have the commercial. So trouble, getting someone that's going to take care of it.
Let them unmute themselves and let's pick up the problem.
Fine by me.
I can still do it on this end too, but it'll say they can do it themselves.
Yeah, I don't know if you have a preference to whether you want it to be.
I mean,
I usually don't. Maybe I'll just not allow it.
Yeah, you can unmute him and leave everybody else read it. That's it.
So they're looking at it, but I mean.
So I can't mute it.
Todd, are you able to hear us?
I'm able to hear you. Can you hear me?
Perfect. Yes.
Great, thank you.
So Todd, we'll run the slides from here and you can just tell us when to advance.
That's great. Thank you, Brad.
Okay. Yes, sir.
That's true, that's true.
Leave that up there, remind everybody they're on screen until you start your.
Okay, that's fine.
Hey,
Hey,
Brad.
Joanne, how you doing?
Good to see you.
See you.
We definitely are getting some interest in that, so that's the least. Yeah. Oh, is it? We get comments. You can only do what the ordinance says. And it's crazy busy. I love it. And some days I go, what did I get myself into? Yeah. Sorry, I'm not supposed to say anything.
Can you see that there?
Todd, are you able to see the slides?
No, I cannot see the slides.
All right, hang tight.
It's tough. Great town. Board members are very conscious of, they don't want to provide services. I mean, they don't want to provide things without paying for it. That includes staff. Yeah, there's questions now whether it will be announced for a while. We've got enough work for a long time, but I think that's the challenge. We're thinking on positions too. Fire and rescue, so it's tricky. It's kind of hard to, but
You can see the slides now.
You can't.
Okay, yeah, it's really meant to be kind of like a high level discussion, and I think try to have like going at some point. You introduce, then tell me when to get up. Give me kind of like 8 minutes.
As long as we're working our concert, don't we?
Yeah.
Do you have an email list that you're also?
It's in the garage. I've done it.
For the sign-in sheet, is an email as well? Okay. Not that big.
Oh, no, it's 2 people. Yeah. I think they did that.
Yeah, there's the sign-in sheet,
But it's
there's
fun to drive.
handouts.
We are
All right, everyone. I'd like to thank everyone for coming in here and everyone on Zoom. This is our second community meeting to discuss bike and pedestrian planning in the Goochland Courthouse and Centerville villages. We have a presentation for you this evening. If you do want to make any comments or any more recommendations on what you see tonight or anything regarding the bike and ped planning, we ask you to give those comments to us next week so we can forward them on to the consultant. The presentation is going to be led by Brad Shelton, who's leading the consultant team that has been preparing this plan. A couple of items I would like to make a couple of introductions. Mr. Spoonhour and Mr. Sharp are here from the Board of Supervisors. And before turning it over to Mr. Shelton, Ms. Sharper, would you like to have the floor for a minute?
Hi, how are you all? I'm only going to take a second. I'm Jamie Sherry. I'm Director of Community Development. In addition to the plan that we have going on, you're going to see a study that's going on tonight that you're going to see the results of tonight. We also have 2 village studies that are going on. Probably already know about them, but I just wanted to make sure that you have an opportunity to learn more about it. You can do that on the sign-in sheet if you want to be informed about either of the villages, either here in the Goochland Courthouse or the Centerville village. Make a little note next to your email and we can add you to our notification list. Anytime any new information goes out, we send out an email blast so that people know more additional opportunities to participate. I have some cards here. We have an active survey going on for each of the villages. There's a QR code, so you can hit your phone with it. You can take the surveys. We also have 2 more announcements, and then I'll get this back to our team here. We have 2 community meetings scheduled for the 2 village plans. The first one will be held on June 8th. That is for the courthouse village. That will be located here at the administration building. That meeting will be from 7 to 9. The next night we will have the Centerville Village midway meeting, and that will be on June 9th, and that will be located at Grace Chinese Baptist Church on Broad Street Road. Okay, thank you for that time. Oh, 7 to 9 for both meetings.
With that, I'd like to turn it over to Shelton.
All right, thanks. Welcome, everybody. As Tom mentioned, my name is Brad Shelton. I'm with Michael Baker International, and we are the lead consultant for the effort that we're going to be talking about tonight. I'm actually joined online by Todd Gordon with their partner firm, EPR. And Michael Baker led the transit component of the study, and EPR led the bike ped component of the study. So we'll be handing off a little bit as we talk through the slides tonight. First, I will admit there's some technical lingo in this presentation. We'll do my best to make sure that that conveys so you all understand everything that we're talking about tonight. The first is the title that we were given for the study by the issuer of the grant, which is UDA Multimodal Planning. UDA stands for Urban Development Area. It's essentially where we anticipate to have growth at a little higher density. So for Goochland County, that's the villages that we're going to be talking about tonight. Multimodal means more than one mode. So mode being auto, bicycle, pedestrian, transit. So that's what we're going to be talking about tonight is additional modes besides just auto. So we'll go to the next slide. Who's got the oh, there we go. Okay, all right, thanks. All right. What do we need? Bear with us. Bear with us, folks. We are have a little technical issue here. Oh, there we go. All right, now, thank you, sir. All right, so what we're going to do, the agenda for this evening, we are going to give a brief overview of the study scope. Then I'm going to hand things over to Todd, who's going to walk us through the bicycle pedestrian assessment, and then he's going to hand it back to me, and then I'll talk about the transit assessment that we performed. And then we will offer you an opportunity to provide some feedback and your thoughts on everything that you're seeing tonight. But really what we're here to do is present the draft recommendations of this study. So first off, where did the study come from? Goochland County was awarded a grant from the Virginia Office of the Intermodal Planning and Investment, which is part of the Transportation Secretariat. So they're a sister agency to VDOT, essentially. And these grants can be awarded for the 4 categories that you see here. But what Goochland's grant was awarded under was the first one, which is conducting multimodal planning within an existing or planned urban development area or growth area. The 2 village areas that we're talking about tonight need that designation. So therefore, they were eligible for this award. Specifically, what we're looking to do as we look at the terms of the grant program is to support the intent of that Virginia code number you see there, but we're supporting traditional neighborhood design, which includes pedestrian-friendly road design and the connectivity of our pedestrian networks. The expected outcomes of this study are to identify needs and conduct planning activities for multimodal transportation infrastructure. And then we also completed an inventory of the existing sidewalk and bicycle lanes, and that's a data set that we will be turning over to Goochland as part of this effort. Specifically, what our scope asks for us to do is evaluate bicycle and pedestrian recommendations in both Centerville Village and Goochland Courthouse Village. So that means looking at what the infrastructure is that's out there today, identifying where needs exist, where gaps exist in the network, and making recommendations for additional bicycle pedestrian infrastructure. The other thing that we're looking at as part of this study is the demand for potential transit service to Centerville Village. Many of you may be aware, we currently have transit coming out of Short Pump now. Centerville is just a short distance away from where the transit line ends now. We're seeing increased demand in Centerville. So the idea was, let's just take a look and see what the data is telling us as to whether or not we are meeting a threshold for transit there or not. So all of this supports state efforts to promote safe alternatives to vehicular traffic. And of course, our study areas, most of you I'm sure are very familiar with. Centerville, as you're all aware, just adjacent to Henrico County. A lot of growth pressure occurring in Centerville as growth continues to move west down Broad Street. Obviously, we have major attractors in the Centerville area, such as the West Creek Office Park, where Centerville is the northern gateway to West Creek. And then we also have a lot of industrial development north of Centerville. So we have a combination of various users on the roadway network in Centerville. Goochland Courthouse, as we all can all see out the window, is a little bit more pedestrian friendly. We have higher density development in Centerville. We have some existing sidewalks, existing street lights, things that provide that Centerville neighborhood character that everyone in this room, I'm sure, can recognize. So these are two areas we're focused on. Again, we're looking at bike ped alternatives for both villages. We're only looking at Centerville with regards to transit assessment. So from there, I'm going to, well, first off, I'm going to pause for any quick questions on the scope and what we're looking to achieve with this study.
Just a quick
Yes,
clarification, when you were talking about the population density and the pedestrian friendly, you said Centerville, but I think you meant Goochland?
Oh, I'm yes.
Just
Thank
wanted
you.
to clarify that.
Thank you. Yes.
Another question.
Yes.
Is there any feasibility that golf cart path could be considered in this in Centerville?
We did not consider golf cart paths as part of this study. We were primarily focused on improvements that could be done within the existing right-of-way, within the available right-of-way.
I can add that a little bit. The board did pass an ordinance a few years ago where there are qualifying neighborhood streets. They could look at having golf carts approved. I want to say off the top of my head, it had to be a residential character. It had to be like 25 miles to the class. But if you're interested in looking at that for any specific roads, give me a call and take a look at least what the process is for getting that.
Okay. With that, we'll go ahead and roll into our bicycle and pedestrian discussion. Todd, can you hear us?
I can hear you. Are you able to hear me all right?
Yes, we can hear you fine. So I'll go ahead and go to your first slide and you just tell me when to advance.
Please, thanks very much. So I'm Todd Gordon. I'm senior planner at EPR, a community planning and engineering firm. We're based in Charlottesville. And so EPR has been the subconsultant to Michael Baker International on this and responsible for the bicycle and pedestrian analysis. And so the goal of this work is to recommend bicycle and pedestrian improvements that might promote connectivity, accessibility, safety, and appropriate design in the courthouse and Centerville villages. So ultimately, the network of bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure in Goochland is very likely to be built in lots of very small pieces. Some of those pieces may be built by the county itself, while some of those pieces may be built as parts of development as these areas grow. And so also, as Brad mentioned, our study really focused on improvements that can be made within existing rights of way. So simpler improvements on land that's already publicly owned, which doesn't mean that other types of proposals for off-road paths or other things aren't valid, but we chose to focus on those for this effort. I think the expectation is that both of these areas will continue to grow and that development within these areas will provide bicycle and pedestrian accommodations on their streets as they come along. So our analysis here starts with activity centers. So that is based on community input that we got back in the fall, based on input we've got from your county planning staff, and field observations that we've made in the area. So essentially, where do people want to go? Where are people coming from? And where can we reasonably make connections safely for people to travel by bike or by foot if they choose to do so? So the next step here is recommending appropriate types of infrastructure. So we're making decisions on what's appropriate. So the different types of infrastructure are appropriate in different places. On very high volume, high speed roads, we want to look to sidewalks that are separated from traffic in ways that people feel safe. On very low speed, low volume roads within neighborhoods, it may be perfectly possible for people to walk and bike in the street with cars safely. And so we go through a recommendation there. So the chart that you see on the screen is a decision tree, and this is part of the analysis deciding what's appropriate where. So if we can make connections, we should make them. In very low traffic situations, less than 1,000 cars, then there are certain appropriate treatments. Where speeds are higher, we need to separate bicycles and pedestrians from traffic. Where right-of-way is available, we want to separate them as much as possible. We'll do an example to show that in greater detail if you move to the next slide, Brad. Beyond that step, this study looked at prioritization. So we need to understand that we can't build a network all at once. So what are the steps we should take first? What are the prioritized projects here? So we prioritized these projects and gave them priority scores based on 3 different criteria. Those criteria are traffic stress, community need, and tactical viability. So traffic stress is, let's prioritize projects where speed and high volumes of traffic and safety make projects very critical to protect people's safety. Community need says, let's prioritize projects near schools, near activity centers, near areas where employment and residential density are high. Essentially, projects that'll get the most use. And finally, tactical viability means prioritizing projects that are most likely to be funded, that are most likely to be viable to construct. So we want to stress at this point that this is a data-heavy process, but and that data is very useful, but it's not the whole process. Local opinion, available funding, and many other factors will play into which project you do and when. So I want to stress that these recommendations that we'll show you are informed by data, but not decided by data. Next slide, please, Brad. So we'll do an example of this analysis to help you understand how we've walked through this. So this example is, let's look at River Road right through the courthouse, right past the courthouse, more or less outside the window there. So you all know the road. It's a relatively wide, relatively straight 2-lane road. The primary access to the courthouse and many other commercial services has sidewalks on one side all the way down. On the other side, the west side, there's a few bits of sidewalk, but lots of big gaps. There's no bicycle facilities. So that's how it stands now. Brad, if you could go to the next. So thinking about pedestrian facilities, we go through several methods of deciding what improvements are possible or desirable. First of all, we see that River Road is located easily within a quarter of a mile of major activity centers. So pedestrian travel is very much expected. The traffic on that road is well over 1,000 cars a day. That means it's not safe for people to walk in the road. We need to separate pedestrians from traffic. So we look at the speed limit of that road, which is 35. So sidewalks should be detached and make some space between the roadway and the sidewalk wherever possible in order to make people feel safe and comfortable walking next to moving cars. So that leads us to a recommendation of separated sidewalks on both sides of the road. One exists. We'd like to fill in the gaps to make the other exist. So looking at bicycle facilities, you can bike farther than you can walk. So is the road located within 1 mile of activity nodes? And it is. So you certainly expect people to ride their bikes around that area. Again, that traffic is high, which means it's best to separate bikes from traffic with a speed limit of 35. So we want to get bicycles out of the travel lane, separate cars and bikes so they don't interfere with each other. And in this case, we've got a nice wide pavement on River Road. It's about 36 feet. That's 18 feet per lane. That's well more than you need for just a travel lane. So in this case, we're looking at a recommendation of striping bicycle lanes, separating a lane for cars and a lane for bikes. There's room on the road. Because this is the center of the village, reasonably expect that people would use them. So this is the type of analysis that we looked at. Activity centers, traffic, speed, and pavement. for recommendations throughout both villages. The next one, please. So then the priority of those. We talked about traffic stress, that is how fast your car's going, how much traffic, et cetera. We're rating River Road, it's sort of moderate. It's not the busiest road in both villages, but it's well-traveled, certainly. This area would be rated high for community need. Access to the courthouse, access to various businesses that people would love to visit. High population density relative to Goochland County, and employment density as well. So high rating for that. Project viability is moderate. It's a pretty good sized road. There's plenty of right of way, which is good news. It makes good connections, and so sort of moderate project viability, relatively easy to install, but some hurdles to overcome as well. Next. All right, so let's look at all the recommendations for Goochland Courthouse. I'm going to show you some maps here that have a lot of things on them. I hope you'll have the opportunity to look more carefully at some of the information that we've provided. But this is the existing courthouse showing existing pedestrian infrastructure. As I said, there's along River Road, there's a sidewalk all along the east side, lots of gaps on the west side, otherwise few sidewalks provided. And the next. So the recommendations that we're including in this study include expanding that sidewalk network, going farther south on River Road to reach Tucker Park, going down Fairground to reach Hidden Rock Park, and going up Bulldog Way to reach schools, the ones that exist and the ones that are coming. So expanding that network to reach the places that people reasonably could walk to. And next. So looking at bicycle infrastructure, there isn't anything in the courthouse at this time. So nothing available just yet. But next, looking at recommendations of this study, we'd like to see bicycle lanes provided in the core of the village on River, as we were just talking about in the example, a little bit up Sandy Hook to Fairground. I'd like to see shared lane markings in certain places. That's where we don't stripe a bicycle lane, but we do provide pavement markings that allow people, that gives people some notice that bicycles may be present in the roadway. We think that's appropriate on Bulldog, other areas of Sandy Hook and River. And finally, wide shoulders. Now, wide shoulders are not provided at the village edges, we hope, as a sort of minimum measure of safety for people who chose to bicycle those routes. These are not necessarily recommended routes or routes that will be bicycled often, but they will appeal to your more hardcore cyclists at this stage. And adding extra pavement could increase safety for cyclists, but also for drivers as they move around cyclists who may be sharing the road. And next slide, please. This map shows those bicycle and pedestrian recommendations combined. The hope is that this creates a complete network where people can move around, as Brad said, in a multimodal fashion, cars, bikes, and pedestrians, where you have option. So let's move on and talk about Centerville a bit on the next slide. The one after that, actually. So looking at the existing pedestrian infrastructure in Centerville, there's some that exists, mainly because developments have installed sidewalks as they've been built. So Reader's Branch has sidewalks, Saddle Creek has some sidewalks, a few places in front of the Food Lion Shopping Center and the newer commercial development east of 288. So that's what exists. Some great little spots of infrastructure, but no real connections, no real network. Next. So the recommendation here is to work to complete that network. So sidewalks we'd like to see added to the core village area, that is along Broad, along St. Matthews and Mannequin and Hockett, to reach existing points of activity in both neighborhoods and shopping. Someday those sidewalk recommendations may reach outlying roads like Three Chopped or Rockville as development increases in this area and reaches those roads. And then also appropriate crosswalks are marked on this map at major intersections. So we'd like to see those crosswalks marked ADA accessibility, that is curb ramps provided, and pedestrian signals added where you have existing traffic signals. Next. Bicycle infrastructure, again, not much to speak of. There is a small paved path that went in as part of the Reader's Branch development that might be called part of a bicycle network. But aside from that, nothing specific available just yet. And next. So several types of bicycle infrastructure again. Bicycle lanes, the most formal type, could be provided along Briggs Drive, adjacent to the Broadview Shopping Center. Shared lane markings along Plaza Drive in a way that allows or notifies cars that bikes may be present. And then wider shoulders would ideally be provided along more outlying routes, again, as that minimum measure of safety at this stage. Now, as development in this area progresses, those areas may become part of the official bicycle network and may become more formal bicycle routes in the future as Centerville continues to grow. Next slide, please. I think, again, just shows that combined map of bicycle recommendations and pedestrian recommendations, in addition to potential future routes that may come that are called for in the county's comprehensive plan as Centerville continues to develop, grow, and many of these parcels see development. Next, please. So let's talk a minute about facility types. I mentioned some of these as I went through and showed where they were marked on the map, but I will talk about them in a little more detail on the next slide, please. So sidewalks, that's the sort of default option when it comes to pedestrians, and you all are familiar with sidewalks. So 5 feet is a standard, considered a standard sidewalk width. That width may get bigger, as much as 8 feet in particularly vibrant commercial areas, in the cores of the villages in some places. We'd like to see sidewalks on both sides of the street in the core of the village. Outside of the core and more outlying areas of the village, one side of the road is perfectly acceptable. It allows people to make that connection at a slightly lower expense overall. Now, we talked about traffic stress, and next to higher speed roads, next to higher volume roads, we'd like to see pedestrians separated from traffic as much as possible. It makes people feel safer, makes them actually safer, makes them feel better about walking next to that road. So a landscape buffer that is a little bit of grass or some trees planted between the sidewalk and the road is appropriate on those higher traffic and higher speed roads. But I think in all cases, you want to separate that sidewalk and provide as much comfort and safety as you can within the space that you have available to build. Next slide, please. So we want to, where those sidewalks come into contact with the street, we want to provide crosswalks at intersections. The design that's pictured there is the preferred design called the Continental Crosswalk. It's a high visibility crosswalk. We want to make pedestrians as visible as possible to motorists. We want to provide ADA accessible curb ramps wherever sidewalks meet those crosswalks. And where there are existing traffic signals, we want to provide pedestrian signals. That is the signal that says walk now or don't walk, to organize that traffic for the safety of everyone. Where intersections don't have traffic lights, you may have unsignalized crosswalks where by law traffic yields to pedestrians, slows down and lets folks cross. Bicycle lanes are another that I mentioned and that we showed recommendations for on River Road in the courthouse and on Briggs Drive in Centerville. So the standard bicycle lane is striped on the street in a way that's 5 feet wide with the occasional bicyclist icon that shows the use of that lane. So it's a totally separate facility for bicyclists outside of the travel lane. On especially busy roads, you may buffer that bicycle lane by providing 2 stripes and a kind of buffer between. And we'd like to see bicycle lanes used on roads with speed limits 35 miles per hour or less, where they can be safest both for drivers and for cyclists. Next. All right, I mentioned these shared lane markings. On certain roads that are both lower traffic volume and lower traffic speed, and where the expectation is for a lower level of use by cyclists, it can be appropriate to provide a shared lane marking. Sometimes it's called a sharrow, and that's that icon painted on the street that you see there, a bicycle and a couple of arrows. So the purpose of that is to make drivers aware that bicyclists may be traveling on this route, and also that bicyclists have a right to travel on this route. And so it can be appropriate in some conditions for cyclists and vehicles to share the same lane. And finally, the paved shoulder. On these more outlying routes at the edges of villages or even beyond the villages, providing a little extra pavement at the shoulder of the road can provide some safety for cyclists. It is not necessarily an officially marked bicycle route, and it will probably be used mostly by real veteran cyclists, but provides a measure of safety and also reserves a little bit of space that may be incorporated into a more formal bicycle network in the future as some of these areas grow and see houses built along them, maybe commercial development built along them. And the next slide, please. That was the end of my slides. So I will turn this back over to Brad, and we will certainly appreciate your questions and input once we get to the end. Thank you.
Thanks, Todd. So we're going to go through these transit slides, and then we'll pause and we can take questions on anything that you've seen and anything you're about to see. So just bear with us, and we'll get through the rest of the content here. But as I mentioned, we are tasked as part of this study to evaluate whether or not Centerville exhibits the appropriate characteristics to support transit service. So the things that we look at when we want to evaluate whether or not an area can support transit are a number of factors. We want to look at what the population is, but not only how many people live there, but how dense is the population, how many people are in a specified area. The same thing with employment. How much employment do we have, and what's the density of that employment? We also are looking at land use characteristics, things such as the presence of sidewalks, how far setback buildings can all play into whether or not a place is appropriate for transit. But we're primarily looking to see what the characteristics are of Centerville. Disadvantaged populations are an important consideration. Obviously, transit is a tremendous benefit to folks who either are disabled and can't drive, or elderly and can't drive, or frankly just don't own a car. We also want to take into account commute patterns. Where are people coming from? Where are they going to? And are they going to areas that are currently served by transit? Their trips could be served if the transit were extended. And then also we wanted to look and see what areas does GRTC currently serve and how do they match up to Centerville's characteristics. So we kind of have 4 primary evaluation methods that I'm going to cover tonight. We have a lot of data in the report, but I'm going to try to keep this fairly high level. But we're looking at activity density, which is the number of population and employment in the area, at the density of those factors. Equity emphasis scoring, which looks at that disadvantaged population item. And then we looked at origin destination analyses, and then also looked at those areas currently served by GRTC to see what kind of activity density those areas have. And I know that's a lot, but I'm going to spell it out in these next few slides. So the first factor that we looked at is what I refer to as activity density. And this is a standard accepted way to look at whether an area can support transit. So it's defined as population plus jobs per acre. So how many jobs and people do we have in a given amount of space? So the rule of thumb is that an activity density of 5 is generally considered a transit supportive density. So what we did was we pulled data from the Rich Regional Planning District Commission. They keep an updated a set of data for population and employment. So we use their data, and it's in these areas referred to as traffic analysis zones, and that's all of the little shapes that you see on this map are those traffic analysis zones. So what you can see for Centerville, first off, the traffic analysis zones don't match up perfectly with the Centerville boundary. So we had to do what was called an area weighted density to figure out exactly what's going on in Centerville. So we're not getting dinged for all these low density areas outside of the boundary. So when we did that analysis, we came up with an activity density of 1.68. So significantly lower than the kind of rule of thumb of 5. I will note that the TAZ that you see here in the darker green in Centerville has an activity density of 3.5. That is the highest activity density in all of Goochland County. So still below the 5, but it's not bad, especially for a suburban county. Important to note that TAZ does extend south of the Centerville boundary and therefore does incorporate West Creek Office Park. So that is driving some of those numbers there. So the conclusion from this first analysis was that no, Centerville does not meet the minimum transit supportive activity density. So that's just activity density. So that's just one factor. So the next thing we wanted to look at was what's referred to as equity emphasis scoring. And this looks to see whether there's a need for transit access due to traditionally disadvantaged communities. So again, we're just focusing on the Centerville boundary, and we use data from the census, and that's where the American Community Survey is. That's something that's developed by the census. And the specific tables that we looked at covered poverty level, male versus female, various race and ethnicity, language and age, whether folks were disabled or not, and then of course total population. So all of these elements go into that calculation to determine what that equity emphasis score is. And the process for developing that is established by the state. They have a methodology that they use to calculate this, and we follow that methodology, but at a much finer grained level to really hone in on what's going on in the Centerville area. So if we look at Virginia's statewide transportation plan that's developed by VDOT, they say that the threshold equity emphasis score for transit access is 2. So when we looked at Centerville, the equity emphasis score is 0.6. So again, Centerville did not perform well on this indicator as far as being transit supportive. For comparison, if we look at the equity emphasis score for the entire GRTC service area, it's 5.55. So again, Centerville is significantly lower. It is kind of interesting, however, to note, and this obviously doesn't impact what we're doing in Centerville, but we do have some areas south and west of Centerville that have higher equity emphasis scores. Of course, we do know that we have correctional facilities in those areas as well that could be skewing some of those numbers. But just an important note. So we did perform, as you can see, we did the analysis for the entire county. So the county will have that data moving forward. So the next thing that we looked at, it didn't perform so great on the first 2 metrics, was we looked to see, well, where are the trips coming from and where are they going to? So for this, we wanted to see where exactly are trips that are originating in Centerville, how many trips are going to the Broad Street corridor, which currently is served by GRTC, and then the GRTC network as a whole. So we did kind of 2 calculations, vehicle or traffic trips coming from Centerville going to the green area, trips from Centerville to the green and purple area, And then the reverse of that, trips that are starting in these areas and ending in Centerville. And the way we did that is we used another census data set, which has a very long name, the longitudinal employer household dynamics origin destination employment statistics. There will not be a test, you'll have to remember that. But that's census data where businesses provide information on where their employees, frankly, where they live. So they know where they're coming from and where they're going to in their commute every day. So what this told us is that there are actually a lot of trips coming to Centerville. There are 3,717 trips based on this data set commuting to Centerville. Now,
What time?
what time?
Per day, per week?
Yeah, this is daily. This is daily.
Thank you.
And important to remember, again, this does include the West Creek area. As you can see how large this red area is, because this is the smallest geography we could get for this data. So it does include West Creek. So keep that in mind. So there are a lot of trips coming to the Centerville area from the GRTC transit area. But you know, this shows that Centerville is a regional employment destination. So even though the trips may not be ending in the village boundary, they are coming to this area. So that's the takeaway from this, is we do have a lot of trips that technically could potentially be served by transit if transit were to serve this whole red area. Now, of course, we're just looking at the village for this. So you kind of have to take this with a little bit of a grain of salt because we are not looking at transit to West Creek as part of the study. We're just looking to the Centerville village. But the takeaway is many trips do originate or terminate in the GRTC service area. So there is potential that trips could be served by fixed route transit. So the last thing that I want to cover tonight is we thought, well, let's look and see what areas are currently served by GRTC and what are their characteristics like and how do they compare to Centerville. So what we did was we looked at the activity density for the entire GRTC service area. And what we found was we have two TAZs in Henrico County that are both at the ends of transit lines, much as Centerville would be, that have activity densities that are actually lower than what we saw in TAZ 657. So that activity density was 3.49, and again, that's jobs plus population by acre. And these two areas have densities of 3.16 and 3.35. So the locations are somewhat similar to Centerville in that they would be at the end of a transit route, but they have less activity density. So there is a precedent for transit to serve areas with activity densities comparable to what we're seeing in Centerville. So that's the conclusion, is that Centerville does exhibit similar characteristics to other areas currently served by GRTC fixed route service. So is it a slam dunk? No, but there are some indicators saying that there is an argument to be made that maybe transit should be in the conversation. So what we saw is that the origin destination analysis revealed that there's many commute trips that can be served by fixed route transit coming to the Centerville area, and that we have an activity density that's similar to other areas currently served by GRTC. The most logical extension of GRTC is we currently have the Route 19, which goes to Bon Secours Parkway, Aldi, I believe, right there. So it's their stop. The line ends behind the Aldi. Less than half a mile is all we would need to bring that over the Goochland County line to the Wilkes Ridge development. And the Wilkes Ridge development is a good candidate for discussion because we have a lot of employers in this area. We have sheltering arms facilities back here. We have some fairly high density residential. We have sidewalks on these networks, which would facilitate pedestrian access to a transit stop in the Wilkes Ridge development. And then we have this conveniently a loop road that already exist that would permit a bus to turn around. So the low hanging fruit would be to extend the Route 19 to the Wilkes Ridge development. Really, the stop could be as a stop could be installed for less than $2,500 if it's similar to what we're seeing at Bonsecours Parkway, which is simply a sign on a post with a little bit of sidewalk in front of it. Shelters would be more expensive. We had benches and shelters that price can go up. I will note that GRTC did a assessment last year, or maybe 2019 actually, where they looked at two concepts. So one of the concepts was, well, what if we looked at extending the coverage of our transit network? And it actually included this in this. And at that time, they estimated that implementation of this would cost $60,000 for the operational expenses for that service. So there's been some discussion. It's on GRTC's radar, but the question is, well, do we, will they advance something like this with the activity density that we have? But we think that there's an argument to be made for such a service. The other thing that we looked at was the additional growth and anticipated growth in the area. So we do think that the Centerville Village core probably does not have the density to support transit currently, but it should be monitored as growth occurs in the future. We also have a new parking ride lot going in at 623 and I-64. That facility primarily serves I-64. Traffic on I-64 continues to increase, demand continues to increase for park and ride services. That could be another location to monitor as a potential future island transit. And then of course, West Creek, which we know has the majority of the destinations in this area. But obviously West Creek is it's not easy to get there from here. Now this would be a first step towards maybe future expansions, but those would have to be monitored as growth occurs. So at this point, we see this as being a low-hanging fruit and probably the best bet for advancing transit. So that wraps up really the formal presentation, and we really wanted to really open the floor to you all. We know that was a lot of information to take in, but we welcome any comments or anything you've seen or things that you liked, things that you were hoping to see that you didn't see, or just any general questions on the process or the work that's been conducted. Yes, sir.
Thank you. On the transit, we just wrapped up on the transit a second ago. I'm assuming you just looked at what I guess I'll call, because I don't know any better, traditional bus lines. I mean, because GRTC is looking at things like microtransit and things like that, that I think they're just exploring. But you looked at just bringing a traditional bus line in, right?
Great point. We considered microtransit, and there is actually a separate microtransit study going on led by GRTC at this moment that Goochland County is participating in.
Region-wide look.
Yes. Yes. And what we ultimately came back to the fixed route service because primarily microtransit, you have to have a service area, and we were just looking at how can we get to Centerville. So you need kind of a larger service area for that microtransit, circulator to work. The other advantage to extending fixed route, especially because you already have service out on the road, you don't have to purchase a vehicle. So with microtransit, you have to purchase vehicles, and of course that cost goes up significantly. Whereas with the extension, you're just looking at operating costs, and like I said, you can put in a basic stop for $2,500. You would take. Yeah.
Is that $2,500 fee, one-time fee?
Yeah, that's just for the construction of the stop. Assuming you're not purchasing right away. Just if you look at what's behind the Aldi, it's literally a sidewalk with a post, and that's all it is.
Any additional cost to the county? Any additional cost besides that?
Well, it would, that would be the discussion that would need to occur with GRTC. As I mentioned, the estimate for that extension, the operating cost would be about $60,000. The Virginia Department of Rail and Public Transportation has funding mechanisms. The primary one is called Merit, and it's a competitive process where you apply for the funding. Typically, if you bring money to the table, you score better with those processes, but you know, those discussions would have to happen.
And it's fair to say, if you want to expand a service like that, you have to define the funding source. There's numerous possibilities, so I think it'd probably be premature to say what the funding source would be, but there's numerous potential funding sources.
What about like? On Wilkes Falls? It seemed to be a pretty wide road. Is that any consideration? To get putting up partial bike lane there?
If you go back to the presentation, the northern part of Wilkes Parkway, while he's doing that, one thing I wanted to just talk about, sort of hinted at it here, but just emphasize a lot of what we went over here were our primary and secondary roads and sort of the backbone network. A lot of our neighborhoods have sidewalks, more sidewalks than bike lanes, but there is an expectation that the developers will be providing an internal network, and those will be connected to this backbone. And then as development occurs along the backbone, it's certainly preferable that the developer will construct their segment as part of their development. But this really focused on the backbone and the primary secondary road and those networks.
Okay. Wake up.
Question about that side.
Yeah.
When was that analysis made? Was it during the pandemic, before the pandemic? I know traffic really changed when people were.
Correct. Yeah. I'd have to look up the actual year, but we're avoiding pandemic data in general for all of our city transportation analyses. Essentially, the entire industry is avoiding anything post 2020. Yeah, but
I'm not sure why that's not working, but I can move it from here or there you go.
Is it working now?
Yeah.
There we go. Which one did you want?
The West Wilkes Parkway, the question was providing a bike lane along
yeah.
Wilkes Ridge.
Oops, so, wait, did I go the wrong way? Yep, there we go. That's the like that. Yeah, so what he's showing, and Todd, I don't know if you can hear us, but the question was about bike ped or bike infrastructure in Wilkes Ridge. And it looks like you're showing Sharrows on Wilkes Ridge. Are you able to hear us, Todd? So, well, as Todd indicated, the methodology for developing the recommendations was based off of the available right of way. So I could, so I don't know if that was a determination as to why he went with Sharrows there instead of a full bike lane, which a Sharrow was a shared lane. But we'll see if we can get him. See if we can get him back. He's still on. There he is. Oh, you're muted, Todd. We're trying to unmute you. No, that's not Todd. There you go. Hey, try it now, Todd.
All right, hear me now?
There you are.
Great. Yes, thanks. So the question of Wilkes Ridge. So this analysis was based on that pre-pandemic data. And so looking at the volume of traffic, speed of traffic, sort of justifies itself to that kind of shared lane marking. But you all will know that Wilkes Ridge is something that continues to develop in rapidly and at great density. So it may very well be that the future case recommends a bike lane in that area, and you do have the pavement width, I believe, to the pavement width is there to make that happen.
crowds on West Creek, I mean, it's bicycles, so they're constant, it's well known. I think that might end up tying in. Nice.
Seen in the same slide, the yellow, so I'm thinking about your point on connectivity. And Tom, I think you made a good point too, as neighborhoods develop, you start to plug them in. This doesn't appear to really take that into consideration. For example, you just mentioned Wilkes Creek, there's talk of a trail that would connect all the way over to Hardywood. You would think that would be an opportunity to connect. I think about what happens today as a matter of practice. You have a lot of bikes on Broad Street. And I don't think there's anything preventing them legally from driving on Broad Street, maybe a nuisance. But why wouldn't, so you have Mannequin Road as a standalone, where you're going to, where you're coming from question. But it doesn't connect anywhere into, I assume that's Ashland Road. So between Mannequin Road and Ashland Road on Broad Street, unless there's like a little dotted line, I can't make it out, but I don't see any point of connectivity with an area that I would think would be a major point of connectivity. And probably also kind of core to the center of Centerville. So those are just some observations. I mean, how, at what point along the timeline do you think about connectivity? And I also tied into Jamie, the whole thing about the village initiatives, how they sync up. So this doesn't look like it's complete to me. I guess would be the way I would keep there.
Yeah, the question of bicycle connectivity along Broad Street is something that was a big struggle throughout this effort. No doubt, Broad Street is a major route, and you can use Broad Street to go some very interesting places. You can go all the way into Short Pump and access all sorts of things. What we find is that there's no room in existing Broad Street to add a bicycle lane. Because of the volume and the speed of traffic on Broad Street, really the safe condition would be to separate bicycle traffic from vehicle traffic. So I think ultimately in the short term, Brad mentioned the term low-hanging fruit. There's no low-hanging fruit on Broad Street, unfortunately, at this time. I think the long term, if you can find a way to make connections parallel to Broad, but off of Broad, that will be very valuable. And I think that is the way that it would need to be done. This analysis focused on existing rights of way, and unfortunately, the existing right of way is not sufficient on Broad.
So for example, then if I'm looking at Mannequin Town, that could be, as the development of Mannequin Town, that would be a natural way for people to ride their bikes to Mannequin Town to get to Plaza Drive. And then there'd be crosswalks at Plaza Drive. That way you can cross to the other side of the street on your bike. But that's for more recreational riding. I think the hardcore riders are going to continue to ride on Broad Street and just deal with traffic.
Right.
Yes, there are some hardcore cyclists out there who will ride in that kind of traffic, and bless them.
What about traffic calming between the core village area? Is there any consideration given to slower traffic speed, say between Ashland Road and Mannequin Road? We look to have higher density, higher core, and that would encourage, I think it would be good for economic development as well, rather than just have it as a pass-through, but trying to create traffic calming measures in that particular area. There could be other areas, but that one comes to mind as an obvious one.
Yeah, that's a very valid observation. It's sort of an unfortunate condition that Broad Street Road, which is a major regional way, is in fact the main road of Centerville Village. And that road with its width and its volume is not very village-like. So yes, traffic calming within the village might allow that road to have a very different character. That sort of study of vehicle traffic is a bit outside of the scope that we went through here. I think you're also going to run into some roadblocks when it comes to state transportation network and the importance of Broad Street as a regional route. I don't say that to discourage anyone or to suggest that that's not something that you ought to pursue, but it's going to continue to be a real tough question here.
Yeah, it's interesting because you see Ashland, for example, they have Route 1 that goes through the core of Ashland, and that's part of their study that has a 30-mile-an-hour speed. West Point is another one that comes to mind. There are a number of examples that you have major secondary roads that in a core village area, they figured out a way to have slower traffic speed. So it'll be something I think just for the county to consider.
I mean, would say, traffic calming is outside the scope of this study, but that doesn't mean that Broad Street would be a good candidate to look at for traffic calming measures.
I
certainly
would suggest
that can be done and coordinated with crosswalks that are kind of highlighted.
Yeah, because I know at the time when the road widening of Broad Street took place, there was a lot of citizen input. I think a lot of things have to be considered. And I know Tom, you were involved in that. It didn't happen for whatever reason, financial reasons, whatever. But maybe it's helpful to dust some of that off.
Yep, it's a very good point.
Any more questions?
The only other question I had is to go back to the slide on West Creek. Assumptions. I think that, have you talked to the employers? I mean, I'm thinking that Sheltering Arms would be of interest to have a bus route go to the facility. I would think that, Avery Point is being developed, that may be an opportunity for employers to encourage it. But the thing about the assumptions where I think we have to be careful of is you're including West Creek and Centerville together. And, Capital One by itself has 13,000 employees that live all over the place. And if you talk to them, you have a lot of young professionals or young families that prefer to live in Chesterfield, and they come in on 288, they prefer to live in Rico for whatever reason. But you also have a huge population that prefers to live closer to downtown Richmond, and they commute. So just that one by itself, Capital One, may be a distortion that I think we need to consider and almost take it as an outlier. Because unless you really have Capital One on board to bring bus to their campus, it seems like it would be a not well thought out assumption to base bigger decisions.
Well, a couple things. This was really focused on Centerville, and it's part of economic development. Some entities want the transit service. That's a plus either for employees or for their clients and to commute to the location. But as it relates to like Capital One, if we're going to look at like commuter traffic, for example, whether it's inside or outside of Centerville, it helps the numbers if we want to support transit. So I think.
Well, yeah, if you can use the data to whatever your end conclusion wants to be. I'm just saying is that I think if the assumption is you want transit in Centerville, I think it may be better served to have the transit. I like your suggestion, by the way. I think it makes sense to extend it out like that. It's like an easy call. And it would be beneficial to the employers and Avery Point to some of the new employees that are on board. I would just rather see transit directed to Capital One's campus than to the Food Line parking lot. It would just seem to make more logical sense to go that way with it, if you want transit.
Yeah, and part of the reason is we expressing have to walk before you run. So if we want to get service to into Goochland County, the extension to Centerville would be a significant investment, to say the least. The other point to address is that we use the finest grain data we could, and unfortunately Centerville is such a small geographic area, the data only gets so small. So it's really difficult to parse out what's in the bottom half of that zone and what's in the top half of that zone. And in the first slide where we did the activity density, we did do an area weighted assessment, which is the best attempt we could make at trying to parse that out. And And obviously you saw how low the activity density is, we need to do that. So, but what we sought to accomplish is to look at all the data and what is the data telling us, and that's what we're presenting in this report. So, while Centerville, like I said, Centerville's not, it's not a slam dunk, but we think there's an argument that can be made based on the factors that we looked at.
And Sheltering Arms has reached out to the county on numerous occasions. They have a very strong desire to have the bus extended. They had indicated 2 reasons for that. One is to have a employment base, because they do struggle to have employees. And secondly, they do bring family members in for training and things like that. And many of those family members don't have cars, and they're actually going and picking
I think
them
Avery
up.
Point, you're gonna find, once Avery
And
Point
same
gets settled,
Avery Point.
that's gonna be the same.
Right, Sheltering Arms is so desirable of it, they offered that they could have a bus loop in their parking area. They also offered, I think they have like a 10-minute shift between when one route ends and they start the route up. The bathrooms would
perfect
be
sense.
available and things like that. We have reached out to GRTC, and they are doing a regional plan right now, looking at extending it. This information will certainly help us next time we go and meet with GRTC. Not only do we have a wants needs, but we now also have some data that backs up that it's appropriate.
One last question, I'm sorry. The regional plan for like between Ashland connecting to the capital. Hanover County, all the different counties, but Goochland wasn't part of that. Is that by choice?
We were not. That's the Fall Line Trail. That was
Fall
a
Line Trail,
very,
thank you.
that was a very specific project that funds trail from Petersburg to Ashland. That was funded by the CBTA, the Virginia Transportation Authority. What happened is the localities got together and decided they want to have a win. They want to have a regional project. They selected that project. It did not include the rural localities. So they did, for the rural localities, guarantee them some funding that they could use for their own transportation purposes in lieu, since they weren't going to be connected directly to the capital trail. So Goochland did benefit from that, even though we're not going to get the physical infrastructure.
So like, for example, we could use that money to complete the trail between Wilkes Creek and
We could use that funding for anything transportation related.
but that's something that we've said, we'd like to complete that trail as a priority. And we've seen once, since we get some money, how do we, so if we ask, listen.
$10 million. We have major projects that have been millions of dollars in shortfalls. So Fairground Road, so we never, it's kind of hard to explain. The new tax that was implemented in 2000, half the money comes back to us. 35% of the other half goes to regional projects, and 15% goes to GRTC. Reality was, which being so small, we would never compete for regional projects, but we're actually doing very well. They decided to give us that money back, and we actually used that key back for 30 years.
If it's all been allocated.
Yeah, it's been allocated for other projects, but we are looking at that specific project. We actually had a meeting about that 2 weeks ago. So we are.
That'd be a great resource. I mean, a lot of people.
Oh, absolutely.
They all kind of come together.
Well,
That just seems like a natural.
Yes, I think the participation in studies like this, and just hearing, especially, I'm a West End District 2, but hearing the desire has been fantastic to hear the input. So there's a lot of folks that are listening.
Thank you.
Question, it's not about the study itself, but what is going to be done with the study? Is any of this actually going to happen? I just happen to notice like there's a sidewalk on there from Rears Branch up to Broad Street. And there's no development that I know, no developer is going to proffer that sidewalk anytime soon that I know of offhand. So is this going to be put in a desk drawer somewhere?
No, we touched on this, but what this is, as Jamie alluded to earlier, There's actually 2 planning efforts going on. This planning effort is really kind of narrowly focused on the sidewalks and the bike plans. The other planning effort still becomes a little bit broader, a little bit more comprehensive. The idea is that this is going to be uploaded into that larger plan and it'll be incorporated into that. That will be incorporated into the county's comprehensive plan and our major thoroughfare plan and other plans. Where this plan will absolutely help us 2 ways. It will help us with funding. If we want a lot of the funding is competitive. So when we want to go to these regional, these funding pools, having this plan, having the board endorse it, and go through this effort will make those plans more competitive. But also when we're sitting down with the development community and they're developing property, having this plan, getting this out in front of them, just the depth of this plan and what it shows, it's going to make it much easier in the conversations with them to have them contribute their part. So like I mentioned earlier, they're already oftentimes building networks within their neighborhood. What we would want to do more of is have them build a network, sort of that backbone as we showed on the secondary primary road. So this will have some legs. It's hard to promise which segments. Like Brad alluded to earlier, it's probably going to happen a segment at a time. Certainly, a lot of it's funding driven by funding, but this is going to help us build out the network.
The other thing this study will help us with is at the conclusion of this, when they give us the whole document on this, they will have a ranking of all the priority recommendations. It will include the levels for how easy it would be to be built if the right of way was there, things like that, and then also the cost estimate.
Right.
So as the board, if the board wanted to start allocating money to sidewalks, we would have some cost estimate, or if we wanted to start looking for grants, we would know what the ballpark number is. So while it may not have happened and sidewalks show up in the next year, it is now a tool in our toolbox so that we can pursue.
I should say that, my understanding was that the Ashland Road is eventually going to be extended to get to Hockett. I have no idea when that's going to happen, but this plan didn't include any of that. It's just a dotted line on the map, and that might actually be most likely sidewalk that eventually gets towards.
Yeah. And we sort of did dot it intentionally, and with those roads, we're showing we want a road there, but we don't know what the character of that road is going to look like. So we don't know if it's going to be a Shara or that big lane or so. But to jump directly to Hoggett, so as we define the character of that roadway, we'll define the character of the bike ped. Now, with the Hoggett Road improvement, that project has been funded. It's going to be a few years out. That project already has sidewalks included in it, so that is a part of the project. We'll have to revisit it to see the bike lanes. That was not a part of the original plan for that, but sidewalks were part of the project.
And the character of that road is a parkway. Is the
Hoggett
Ashland
Road
Road.
connection?
No, the Ashland Road, is that kind of a parkway design? You said it, the character of the road. I thought it was.
We were talking about specifically at the Hoggett Road relocation project.
Well, how it connects from Ashland Road between Broad Street and 60th.
We did to arterial management plan study.
That's what I was
And
trying
sort
to
of
say.
the same, that would be, that again, show sidewalks on it. That would be a good candidate to have some bike lanes or something else, as they just picture showed up there. Again, we'll have to refine what the character, what the design scheme, things like that. We already know Ashland is the high volume road. We can do those kind of projections. But as we get into the design of the road, we can get to more carefully define what the bike lane is. Dedicated bike lane, it's going to be separated. I'd like to be share type situation.
So that's been funded by that.
Pocket Road has been funded, not the Ashford. Make sure we're talking two different things. Pocket Road
There's an
relocation.
arterial, if you go on the website, you can see there's an arterial plan for that road that has, it's called a parkway, and it has all kinds of avenues So, but that's just a long-term transportation plan.
Yeah,
component.
what we did with the arterial management plan, that was kind of a forward-looking document, kind of looking what road capacity we would need, looking, say, 20 years out with full development of Ashland Road, Broad Street, in that area, kind of loading, looking at the future, loading traffic, fully loading traffic on those roads, and kind of figuring out how much road capacity we need.
You speak of Rock Road, what stretch of Rock Road?
That's the stretch from the Ashland Signal, curling back down south.
Projected, so it's projected. Just
Correct.
One last question. Brad, are you the Brad Shelton that authored the Centerville plan as part of your BCU master's thesis?
Guilty.
Great job.
Thank you, sir.
I have a copy of it. I've read it several times.
Great job.
And he was also a planner here for the county.
I knew that.
for many
I wanted to
years,
make sure it was the same Brad Shelton, but
And it was the VDOT project manager for the arterial management plan.
we had great foresight, I thought, for that plan. That was developed back in the 80s and 90s. When was that, 2011?
04. Yeah, but it just seems that it was that long ago. But yeah, but thank you. And I mean, it's great to work on studies like this to hopefully see some of that fruition. It's kind of a fun ride. Yes, sir.
I have a question probably for Mr. Coleman. Are you using this sort of planning in these villages when you're discussing proffers with developers, that they will then know that the county wants a dedicated bicycle path here, a dedicated sidewalk on both sides of roads here, and then connecting the dots as these developments happen to link them together? Is that part of the planning process?
In a word, yes. And the more in-depth and detailed our plan is, the easier that conversation is. When you have a good plan, and you can sit down with the developer, the first time they walk into the office, it's an easier conversation to have, to tell them the board has adopted this plan, they need a plan.
And that's like we stated, that this information will be provided to our consultants for the small area plans. Small area plans are going through the process with the meetings in June. We're looking at adoption sometime in the fall. With that adoption, it would be adopted as part of the comprehensive plan. So the first thing anybody comes in to develop a property, we open the comprehensive plan and can go through what is expected of the development. And we have had a lot of success with doing that. Like a few years ago when they did the arterial management plan, when the Audi facility came in, we had that new road of 4 Range Drive, and they were required to build that road with their development, and it opened up development in other areas. It also showed sidewalks, so we got sidewalks along there. So it's absolutely critical at once this plan is adopted, that's part of the comprehensive plan, so we can use it as our tool to get improvements made by the development community.
Another question. You talked at the very beginning about intermodal planning, and I realize you're talking just about the 2 villages in this plan. In the intermodal model, don't include horses. It's very dangerous to drive a horse-drawn wagon in eastern Goochland, I can tell you from experience. I'm sorry, Lumpkin is not here because he can tell you it's very dangerous to ride a bicycle in many parts of Goochland. I get another question, Mr. Coleman. Is there a larger study than these 2 villages about how to connect the bicycle paths we're talking about? It'd be wonderful to have a bicycle path from Wilkes Ridge down to Hardywood, but are there other routes? In the Capitol Trail could go to Lynchburg if Goochland would apply for the funds. The federal government would just shower us with gold. We could have a trail all along the river, away from the highways. You wouldn't have to. But that's a question, I guess.
I mean, it's fair to say we did not include horse trails as part of this. That's not, and these were really more focused on villages. We did, I think staff sort of envisions using some of the details in this to apply to other parts of the county. I think we'll have to have a conversation on how we would incorporate horses into that.
Well, there are deeded bridle paths throughout much of the county.
Yeah, absolutely, sir.
And that they can also be a network that could be used for bicycles and pedestrians. Right? Something that could bring back into the study.
One more question, this is maybe the least important one, but the comprehensive plan, old one, shows that there's going to be a connection between the Chopper Road that comes from Ashland underneath to over to the Allen property. Is that actually feasible? Is that sounds like it's something that is worth?
Yes. That was sort of a vision. We actually hired an engineering firm. It absolutely is feasible. Actually, the greatest challenge with that is the maintenance of traffic on 288. Without getting into the details, we're talking about building 2 bridge segments. The bridge segments aren't very long. They're only don't have to be long enough to cover 3 Chop Road. But, you know, high level, VDOT says you cannot interrupt traffic on 288. So it's that maintenance of traffic, which is actually the expensive, complex part of that. It is a realistic project, but it's probably a little lower on the priority list. It would be really great for the county for economic development, but today it wouldn't really address the capacity or safety issue. So when we're competing for funding, it's not a competitive project, but it absolutely is a real project. It's on our list of projects to look at.
I don't see any developer profit in that one.
Everything's dependent upon funding, so if we get private funding for it, that makes it more competitive.
There was a question here on, they typed it down there.
It's,
Brad, can you read that?
as I picture sidewalks, I picture a charming and more accessible community. How much is being planned for the growth around to sidewalk and bike areas to shift that picture to one similar to Short Pump, where there's accessible sidewalks to walk about, but growth being towards a new Short Pump? Or is that a question for another meeting? And if so, which meeting is addressing that sort of growth? So I think that's I think they're maybe asking about the character and level of development that's anticipated for Centerville.
I guess that kind of plays back to the planning processes that we're involved in. And thank you to everyone who kind of circled back to my introduction that this will become part of the comprehensive plan. That will be, I guess, part of what we're looking at in this planning process, taking this involved and then taking it to the next level as we again participate in the survey.
Any other questions on Zoom?
I don't see anybody. I texted them saying that they could raise their hand or text a question earlier.
Well, if there are no more questions, you do have a sign-in sheet. If you would sign in, realize that the presentation went through kind of quickly. Maybe you didn't, it was hard to see. We can push that out to you. And we just asked to try to get us comments next week so we can, if you have any comments, we forward them on to the results.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Is there a next meeting?
Okay, very good. Thank you. Yeah, no neon.